We're starting blood. It's like cooking class with Dr. Lecter. Hello, Clarice. I just rewatched Hannibal. I just rewatched Silence of the Lamb. With Hannibal, which isn't as good, but he's just too good. Okie dokie. It's blood. Okay. This is very much of a physio. There is anatomy in this chapter. The anatomy is the cellular anatomy by and large, and it's really much more of a physiological chapter. We talk a little bit, but the blood vessels is something we'll be doing in lab, and the physiology thereof with regard to blood pressure and things like that. So the reason I wanted to start this week and continue it on Monday is I anticipate we'll do a wet lab. I have to make sure I have everything I need. It'll either be this Monday if I have everything. If not, then it'll be the Monday, whatever that Monday is, the 28th. Is that would be the 20, whatever it is, 27th, something like that. So we'll see. So what does it do? We have moved stuff around, a ton of regulation. Think of pH, chemical balances, protection, because that's where antibodies and white blood cells circulate and make their way along. So that's the introductory nugget. Oxygen, delivering oxygen and nutrients. We know that. Process of carrying away waste products, metabolic waste, lungs, kidneys for elimination. They should include the liver because the metabolic wastes are often detoxified there as well. And hormones and endocrine glands, obviously, that's how they traverse. By definition, they traverse by the bloodstream. So, temperature by variations in blood flow are certainly part of it. Heat distribution. As important as anything is that next one, the buffering system and the alkaline reserve of bicarbonate ions. We explore this in blood pressure, we explore this in digestive, and we're going to explore it yet again here, or for the first time here. And really, the major buffer is the carbonic acid buffering system. Like, if there was ever a favorite reaction, it's photosynthesis gone backwards. Remember, I mean, to a lesser extent, but effectively, we're taking water and carbon dioxide with the help of enzymes, creating a weak acid, and weak acids make great buffers. That's carbonic acid. And it's the way I explain buffers. It can either donate a proton or not. Strong acids don't have a choice. They donate all their protons. Weak acids, you got a proton, I'll take it. If not, you want one, you can have one. It's like a Jewish acid. It's like that wonderful movie in Christmas. It's a Wonderful Life. The Jewish version. It's a life. How's your business? We're doing all right. Making a living. Not giving the store away. So, did I miss something? Maintaining adequate fluid balance, and obviously the kidney plays a pivotal role. Antidiuretic hormones. For you guys that weren't an MCAT, and there's like one of you, two of you, it doesn't matter. Preventing blood loss, plasma proteins and platelets in the blood clotting, and we're going to look at that. This is where we look at the clotting cascade. Not an extraordinary, it's not medical school detail, but it's detail. Okay? Prevents infection. Absolutely. So this is sort of to augment those of you who are in immunology, and for those that are not taking immunology, I do an immunology unit. I'm not going to do it. This every other year I don't do it in the same degree of detail because I think it's redundant. So we'll talk about antibodies, we'll talk about complement, we'll talk about white blood cells. Does that sound like somebody was joining us?
Yeah, I think someone did.
Anybody else here? Hi, Mackenzie. I'll email. Hi there. Hola, ¿qué tal? The exam is going to be on Friday, it turns out. So if you're available then, or if you're hooping it up, you can make it. Let me know. email me separately if you want to do it on Friday as opposed to Thursday. Moving back. I'll let Alexa know the same thing because they were going to take it on Thursday. Back I go. So here, back to blood and the composition thereof. And this is, to me, is fascinating. So all this, so again, the context of this lecture is me. Because a lot of this lecture deals with problems vis-a-vis anemia. A lot of, not this lecture, but the chapter, transfusion reactions. All of that material is stuff that's happened, not fortunately not the reactions to me. But I've gotten, I've had a lot of transfusions in a 1.5 year span. Because I was deathly ill. Okay. So it's the fluid. By definition, blood is a connective tissue. Remember, connective tissue, there's nothing that means that tissues don't have to be solid. In this case, the matrix of the blood, the ground substance, and the fibers, which create this effectively the matrix, the fibers are dissolved. Those are the clotting fibers. The dissolved form is called fibrinogen. The plasma effectively is the ground substance that it's located in, and it certainly has cells. And those are the 3 elements that make it. But we don't use the term cells really scientifically because they're not typical cells. Read that as they're either cell fragments or they're non-nucleated cells. So the term formed elements is something that's very specific. So formed elements are the red cells, which are anucleate. They shed their nucleus because they don't need it. Effectively, they have a very, very important job, and their job is very simply carrying oxygen. So the nucleus and the organelles are not necessary for this function. So as they mature, they effectively no longer become, quote, cells in a sense and become formed elements. The platelets are fragments of cell membrane with an abundance of proteins for clotting and other factors. They are formed, yes, but they're certainly not cells. The only true cells are the white blood cells, collectively called leukocytes, even though they're certainly, when we look at them with stain, they're not white. But when you look at them without stain, the hemoglobin of the red cell, so they saw cellular forms that were in red, and for lack of a better term, they were called white blood cells, how they got their name. So this is very, very famous. We actually can do this in the lab with it doesn't look quite the same, but we can actually measure something called hematocrit, which is an extraordinarily important measure for you MCAT people to learn about, because that's the principal measure for anemia. And so this is how the blood banks have, so when they have the blood drives, so they usually have a couple of times a year over here in the John Jay, in the gym there. And many of you are familiar with it. What do they do with the blood? The blood is spun down because we use precious little whole blood only for very specific problems. Most of the blood that you and I use from a standpoint in a medical sense are the components. We use plasma, we use platelets, we sift out white blood cells and tinker with them. And for the most part, when we're dealing with anemia, we use red blood cells only. But when they spin down, like anything, centrifugal force, the heavier components, the red cells, and the fluid that's associated with them, go to the bottom of the tube. The white blood cells and the platelet are the next less dense. They accumulate in the middle. And the plasma, you chemistry fans, you'll love this, is the supernatant liquid. Not often I get the term to use supernatant. So erythrocytes are on the bottom, and a typical ratio, because it's a very, very, the white blood cells and the platelets are probably less than 1% of the volume. It's about 55 plasma, 45 for the packed red cells. And that percentage of blood volume that is red cells has a very famous name. It's called the hematocrit, often referred to as the crit. Okay, for short. You can guesstimate by dividing that number by 3 to get approximately the amount of hemoglobin concentration in the blood. So typically for someone at 45, they have a hemoglobin around 15. And you'll see it works that way. This is one of those chapters where I will happily show you my lab. I'll show you my labs. Okay? Because my most recent one you'll see for men is a plus or minus 5%. So 42 to 52. So if you divide by 3, it'd be 14. If my hemoglobin ever gets to be 14, I would celebrate. Right now it's in the 13s. Okay? It's been in the 12s. It's been a lot lower. Okay? In females, proportionally lower. Very simple explanation. We talked about it in endocrine. Okay? The stimulation for most of our blood comes from basically the kidney. Okay, erythropoietin. So our bodies respond, both men and women, when there's a relatively low red blood cell count. The kidneys generate erythropoietin, which stimulates the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. In men, it is augmented by testosterone. Women have a very scant amount of testosterone-like substances that come, those are the androgens that come from the adrenal cortex. Okay, and also menstruation. So particularly during the childbearing and or menstrual years, that's when we see lower. The white blood cells and the platelets form, if you have a big enough tube, we use a capillary tube in the lab. In our lab, you can't really see it very well. And so it's not very distinctive, and it's less than 1%. And it's just, they call it buffy because it's like an off-white or whitish color between the two layers with the plasma sitting on top. So this is the typical tube that you see. The standard, we use a centrifuge like that, but the capillary tubes are tiny. So I have to get it to work. I have to wrap them in cotton and stick them in there, and it doesn't always work. So I'll comment on that when we do the lab. That's there. And you can see that distribution. It's a very quick way to measure it. That's what they used to do. You'd get blood from a finger stick, which is what we do, put it in a capillary tube, spin it, and then calculate the relationship. You just measure with a millimetric ruler, like a typical ruler we use in the lab or like a micro lab, and you measure this, and let's say that it was 20 millimeters, and this was 12, and this was 8. Okay, that's 40. We're good to go. By and large. So it's pretty easy, and it's called a clinical centrifuge. We had one at CCAC North where I taught for about 7 years as an adjunct, but they frowned on me trying to steal it for a year. Not that I didn't try. It's cumbersome to take it out. So moving on with the saga of blood. Blood is sticky. Everybody's bled at some juncture. You cut yourself, you scraped yourself. It's sticky. If you cut your finger and you put your finger in your mouth, it's got a metallic taste, obviously from the hemoglobin, from the iron. That's a component of it. It is, and it gets everywhere. That's the interesting thing about blood. And I said it's the same thing I told you with urine, is blood spreads very easily. If you put a drop of blood on a thing of gauze, okay, a stack of gauze pads that we would use in surgery, the blood goes all the way to the bottom. It easily impregnates as it drips its way down. If you put a drop of saline on it, only the first handful would be wet whatsoever. And it's the old saying, a thimbleful of blood will make a gallon of water turn red, and it does. And so it's easily spread around. It varies with the oxygen content. If you see low oxygenated blood, high oxygenated blood, or anemic blood, they all have a different look to them. You very rarely see it on TV shows. You see it in a hospital. If someone comes in with a terrible injury and they have a pumper, which is a severed artery, and squirting every time your heart pumps blood out, it's a different color than the other blood that's coming out of wounds. It is a distinctly different, it's a more intense red if you want to see it. If it has low oxygen, dark red. If you see anemic blood like I had, And this is my blood when it was a hemoglobin. Are you ready, everybody? Under 6. If you lost enough blood from what your blood supply is now acutely for your hemoglobin to go down to 6, you would be dead. But chronic blood loss, which is what I had, here's the lab tech. How many blood samples have they looked at? He's taking blood out of me. I'm going in for surgery. Okay. And he looks at it and he goes, I've never seen blood like this. This is a bad thing. You don't want to be the exception. I've never seen anybody's blood look like this. Thanks a fucking lot. I didn't say that. That was me. I was just reiterating what I said to the lab tech. pH 7.4 plus or minus 0.05, 8% of body weight, average volume, again, more in man, both size, menstruation, testosterone levels, etc. Plasma, straw-colored, off-white, if you want to think of it that way, mostly water, solutes, lots of dissolved solutes, nutrients, anything that's water-soluble, gases, which are water-soluble partially, hormones, mostly water-soluble because they're mostly proteins, waste products, proteins in general, ions, charged particles. That's what's in plasma. Okay. Plasma proteins are the most abundant by far. They, by definition, if they're plasma proteins, don't go into the cell. That are there, they are mostly produced in the liver. Your principal protein producer. That had a lot of alliteration, didn't it? To sing. Albumin. Albumin is our major protein. So there's a distribution of plasma proteins that are 60, 36, and 4. 60% of plasma proteins are albumins or in the albumin family. Okay. They are sometimes carrier proteins, not all. They have a buffering effect because effectively proteins act as a buffer as well as the carbonic acid buffer. And they're big player. Absolutely. Plasma oncotic pressure. So when you hear about, thank you, the Invisible Man closed the door.
How so?
The Invisible Man closed the door. If you want to see a really, those 3 movies in a row, 31, 33, and 35, 19. Frankenstein, 31, Bride of Frankenstein, and 35, and 1933 was The Invisible Man, all directed by the same guy.
See the new one?
Never.
Oh, it's good.
James Whale. Wait do you see it? Claude Rains was The Invisible Man. It's brilliant. Think of how they were able to do that with the technology of all those years ago and be timeless. I didn't see who's in the new one.
What's the? I believe. Do you watch *Handmaid's Tale*?
Yeah.
I believe it's the main actress in that. I do not know her name, but she's a very good actress.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people. I know a lot of people liked it. *Handmaid's Tale*. A lot of people bought Hulu to start with. Yeah.
I definitely think it's that actress, but I forget her name.
I'll look it up. So, nevertheless, the key player with oncotic or osmotic pressure like that is albumin. What is the classic site? Every time you see a disease, there's a very famous disease called ascites. Ascites is due to malnutrition. The definition of malnutrition, more or less, is not just not enough to eat, it's not enough proteins. So when you don't have enough proteins, here's what happens. I mean, you can't make albumin, you can't make clotting proteins. And when you can't do that, the blood, the water in the blood seeps out due to gravity. And so you see accumulations of fluid by gravity in the limbs, and you see these big bellies. It's a condition called ascites, ASCITES. That is something we see in war-torn countries, poor little children with spindle-thin arms, nothing, chest that you can see every bone, and these big bellies, and people are running, oh, they're fat. No, they're not. It's filled with fluid. there's nothing in the circulation. When it goes through all of their system, it's got another name that I don't see any much, called anasarca from years ago. But that's the big player. So when you hear, if you donate to the Red Cross or to a mission of some type that's going, like now, to the terrible tragedy they had in Turkey and Syria, the first thing they ship are protein-based foods and antibiotics, because your big problems are protein-related, insufficient proteins, and infection, mostly because of the and the liver being a big contributor. So you look at this. Here you go. Electrolytes. We'll take a look at them. Most abundant solutes by number. Cations. We've talked about sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Anions, chloride, phosphate, sulfate, bicarbonate. Obviously, the buffer we'll get to. Plasma proteins, 8% by weight. All the different functions. Albumin, 60% produced by the liver. Osmotic pressure, that's the big player with that. 36% globulins. Next topic. Alpha and beta, produced by the liver. These are transports that principally bind lipids, some vitamins, some metallic ions. When you hear about certain kinds of lipidemias or problems with lipoproteins that I know you've heard about in biochemistry, these are the molecules that do a lot of the transfer, alpha and beta globulins. The antibodies, and we go in the immune system, and you probably, if you had immunology, did you talk about that? Do you guys have immuno? Did you talk about the different alpha, beta, gammas, deltas, IgE, IgD? Yeah, that's where this fraction is. So, and we delve into that again for review. It's not a big deal. And that's about 36%. The last 4%, that's fibrinogen. So it's produced by the liver, and the clotting cascade has one job: converting fibrinogen to fibrin. It basically forms the catalyst that is able to make that transition. And when that occurs, and there's a wonderful illustration in this, effectively, the fibrinogen precipitates out as fibrin. Effectively, it looks like a fishnet microscopically, and it traps red blood cells. And they clot. That's what that's all about. Nutrients we'll get into, from digestive, all sorts of things. Respiratory, obviously, oxygen and carbon dioxide. We'll look at the hemoglobin aspect of it. We look at that more in respiratory physiology. That's where we really look at that oxygen utilization curve, and hormones, with the exception of the steroid and thyroid hormones, which have to be bound. So the formed elements themselves, red cells, white cells, platelets, the only ones that are complete, as I said before, are white cells, the others not. Most of these formed elements have a relatively short lifespan. There are some that have a longer lifespan. The typical red cell has a lifespan, depending on who you read, 90 to 120 days. So if you participated in the blood drive, certainly the red cells, if they're going to use them, they're probably going to use most of them in about 2 months. You sort of have a reference point as to when they're mostly viable. Okay. So and most of the transfusions, as I'll reiterate when we look at that, are what are called pack cells. So because most of the time you're trying to supplement oxygen carrying capability. About the only time you utilize whole blood is when you've had whole blood loss. Think of a terrible accident. Think of a war injury. Think of that type, gunshot wound, stab wounds. That's when you do whole blood. When most of the transfusions we did were for people like myself who had anemia and they transfused pack cells. Or preoperatively, when we would bolster them, their oxygen carrying capability. Post-operatively, if there was a lot of blood loss, we typically had, we would have whole blood on, and the order is very simple. Okay, and I don't know if it's changed in all the years since I've written that order. It would be type and cross match. You only have to cross type once. Okay, type A positive, B positive, B negative, O negative, whatever. Cross match is the complicated part about matching the blood to the best possible donor, to the recipient, based on other surface antigens that are there. So you have to cross match every time. Cross matches get harder after every transfusion because you're getting somebody else's blood and you're building up antibodies. So it makes the cross match harder. So initially, my A positive blood, they could cross match that day. After that, it was a minimum of 2 days. I had to go in and be tested. But sometimes they had to go to another blood bank, Pittsburgh blood. And there's quote unquote true blood bank, I think is Buffalo.
So like whenever was O negative, right? So
Right.
Universal donor, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so with O negative, anyone can typically take that blood and not have many repercussions.
Correct.
But like, and then was it AB positive would be the universal recipient?
If you had your drug, there's that. And now that we look at the positives and negatives, because AB positive has all the three major antigens.
Yeah.
O neg has none. And so that's what you'll hear that order. Watch a TV show where they have somebody in emergency room. You know, somebody comes in, major trauma. You'll put as much blood in. You'll basically say, start them on the rapid infuser with 6 units of O neg. You're trying to replace as much blood as possible. Then type and cross match on standby for OR of type specific blood.
So so you just have.
You're always running out of O neg. O neg is that one where you got to replace it right away.
Gotcha.
Type specific, if someone turns out to be O neg, it's a different story.
Gotcha.
But they're always looking for negatives and they're always looking for O neg. So all of that type. So we'll look at, and that's part of it. And it's a very good micrograph to give you an idea of what it looks like. There's 1,000 times more red cells than white cells, typically. So when we're in this lab, we're doing a white count like they used to do in the old days. So that's part of one of the lab exercises. So white blood cells, one, they're not red, and two, the design of this is all about surface area for carrying oxygen. Okay, the design of think of them as microscopic tentacles because they latch onto. Remember we looked at those microcytes in the CNS unit in that chapter 11. It's on the test, and they have basically white blood cells have tentacles that latch onto stuff. That's their job, and platelets are just fragments. So this is a typical peripheral smear. The name of the stain that we typically use for this smear is called Wright's, capital WRIGHT''S stain. So, what it does, the nature of the stain is it stains the genetic material, the nuclei, DNA, and other structures blue, and some structures red, and then combinations thereof. So what you can see here is the abundance of red cells. To look at a red cell normally, you should see a paler center because of the way it's shaped. It's wide on the edge. The nucleus is gone, so you got this hollow area on the top or the bottom, so the light goes through it. So some of the red cells have more. It just depends on effectively how many there are stacked up. Whenever you look at a slide, it's about how many have one on top of the other. When there's less of them, you see that clear cell. Then you can see the white cells. And in this particular slide, you can count them, 4 different white cells. The hardest one to find, the platelets, are the little fragments. The 4 cells that are white cells that you can find, okay, that you can see, and they're the ones most of you will find. The one you can't is called basic. Every so often you see one of those. The most common is the neutrophil. Okay, the neutrophil, you always know a neutrophil because the granules stain, and we're going to go over this all again. They stain neutral. They're neither red nor blue. So they're pale. Sometimes they're a lilac color. And the nucleus has at least 3 and sometimes as many as 6 lobes. So that's not. They used to call them polymorphonuclear leukocytes. They still do, because their nucleus has many shapes. It's not, it's one nucleus, but it's, ready? Balloon. Like you have one of those long cylindrical balloons and you're making sausage. You got the sausage extruder on your KitchenAid. And you got little casings. You see it on diners, drive-ins, and dives all the time. That's a multinucleated. The eosinophil is very distinctive. It only has two lobes, and EO, because the eosin is the stain, stains those granules red. Granules are important. Lymphocytes look like a whole nucleus, so you have a scant amount of cytoplasm. They're typically, they've got varying size. Sometimes they're smaller than neutrophils, sometimes they're larger, they're in between. You never get, most of the time, once you see in the bloodstream, T cells. And lastly, and I'm going to go over this again when we do the lab, the monocytes are the largest. They become macrophages when they leave the bloodstream. We're going to do this in the lab. You know, what they become when they leave. Most of them stay the same. But monocytes become macrophages, and basophils, not pictured, become mast cells. And we probably talked about mast cells if you're in immunology. So the monocytes eventually morph, and they're larger, and they have that sort of a U or kidney shape nucleus. So it's really, they're called mononuclear forms. So when you hear about mononucleosis, it's an abundance of these mononuclear cells. That's what the virus impacts. It's not just monocytes, it's mononuclear forms. So it's interesting. And so as we continue on, the first thing they look at are red cells. In this particular PowerPoint, I've done it this way for years. Relatively small, okay, 7.5 micrometers, biconcave discs that have shed its nucleus and effectively has no organelles. As it matures, and this is super important, red cells, and we're going to see the transition, all of these cells come from the same parent. Okay. A massive cell that spits out these different cell lines. Red cells are large when they're immature and get smaller as they mature. That's how we classify different kinds of anemias. We classify them whether or not they're big cells, we call them macrocytic, or small cells, microcytic. I have an anemia. Okay, mine is a macrocytic anemia. I'll show you how we determine that. Okay, mine is a probably due to an insufficient amount of vitamin B12. It has a very, very famous name. It's called pernicious anemia. It's an oddball. Most of the anemias that people have are microcytic anemias. And we're able to tell, and there's ways that you can tell that. So effectively, as that cell matures, it gets smaller, and when it no longer needs its nucleus or organelles, it sheds them. And so the nucleus occupies the center, and for all the world, it looks like a lifesaver, except it's the cheap lifesavers, not the one Dr. Badger has. The ones that have they have the thing, like the Lance mints, they have a thing in the middle, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, they're lifesavers that don't have the hole. You can't see through. Which to me is not a lifesaver. It's like you're on a ship. Throw me a lifesaver. Okay, wait a minute. Abbott and Costello, 1948. Spirit of St. Louis. Filled with hemoglobin, a bunch. They're larger than some capillaries, and the beauty of them is because they have a particular plasma membrane protein, they're flexible. So it's like if the door wasn't completely open and the Invisible Man didn't close it and couldn't open it again, you can sort of slide sideways. Red cells do that all the time. Capillaries, they can bend. And most of the time when people have clotting problems today, they use agents that enhance that capability. We try to stay away from some of the compounds that are anticoagulants because the problem with them is you tend to bleed more excessively. So there's a lot of nuances with that. So structure and function, biconcave shape, surface area relative to volume. It's nearly all hemoglobin. No mitochondria, it loses those. ATP production, if it's needed, is anaerobic, so they do not consume that oxygen and transport. Who knew? A red cell. There it is. See, it's got a hole. The hole's filled it. We'll stop at function. We'll pick this up. I'm probably going to have to, while you guys are doing the exam, maybe I'll do a recorded one and throw that in so it gets life a little bit easier for us when we do on Monday so I can have us prep for the lab. Okay, you're good to go.